On the last day of 1970, Paul McCartney walked into a London courtroom and asked a judge to kill the Beatles. He was 28. He had spent his entire adult life inside that band, and now he was suing John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr in the Chancery Division of the High Court, asking for the partnership between them to be legally dissolved. The public verdict arrived within hours. Paul broke up the Beatles. Paul sued his best friends. Paul was the one who couldn't share. And by every reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the story. His first solo album had already divided the critics. His second one would get shredded. John Lennon would answer him on record with one of the most vicious songs ever aimed at another human being. The press had already decided that whatever came next would be a long, embarrassing decline. So here's what Paul McCartney did instead. He started another band. He put his wife in it, even though she had barely played keyboards before. He rented a van, loaded in the kids and the dogs, and drove to a university campus in the Midlands with no manager, no booking agent, and no announcement. Then he walked into a student dining hall and played a lunchtime gig for people who were supposed to be revising for exams. He refused to play a single Beatles song. And within 2 years, that band had a #1 album in America, a James Bond theme, and a record that people still argue is the best thing he ever made without John. What Paul McCartney did after the Beatles wasn't a comeback. A comeback means going back. This was something stranger and harder than that. By the end of this, you'll understand why the man millions blamed for ending the greatest band in history spent the next 50 years proving he never needed it in the first place. Let's start with the part everybody gets wrong. The lawsuit didn't break up the Beatles. The Beatles were already gone. They had stopped touring in 1966. They had lost their manager Brian Epstein in 1967, and with him, the buffer between 4 musicians and a business empire they didn't understand. By 1969, they were barely a band. By 1970, they were 4 men and a very expensive legal problem. The problem had a name: Alan Klein. John, George, and Ringo wanted Klein, a hard-nosed New York accountant, to manage their affairs. Paul didn't trust him and wanted his new in-laws, Lee and John Eastman, instead. He was outvoted 3-1. He would later say he had never even seen audited accounts for Apple, the company that supposedly held everything they'd built. Now think about what that meant for him personally. Paul had married Linda Eastman in March 1969, so when he pushed for her family to handle the money, it looked to the others like a beetle grabbing the wheel. And when they refused, Paul was left with a choice nobody envies. Accept a manager he believed was mismanaging their fortune, or sue the 3 people who had been his closest friends since he was a teenager. He struggled with it all through the summer of 1970. He has said the group was his school, his family, his whole life, and that the men he was about to take to court had been his truest friends. When he finally filed, he wasn't just ending a business arrangement. He was making himself the villain of a story that half the planet had grown up loving. He won. In March 1971, the court ruled in his favor and appointed a receiver over Apple's affairs. Decades later, he would argue the lawsuit was the only thing that saved the catalog from Klein. Nobody wanted to hear that in 1971. What the public saw was a millionaire suing his mates. Paul retreated to a farm in Scotland, drank heavily by his own account, and stopped getting out of bed on time. He has described that period as one of the worst of his life, and the man describing it had been on the roof of Apple 2 years earlier, playing to the sky. So if Paul McCartney really had just destroyed his own career, the next thing he did makes no sense at all. He decided to start from nothing. Try to imagine the album you'd have to make in that position. You have just come off Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Abbey Road, some of the most ambitious studio records ever produced, made with a 100-piece budget and George Martin sitting behind the glass. Paul's answer was to record almost the entire thing himself, largely at home on a 4-track machine with Linda singing harmonies and the children wandering through. McCartney came out in April 1970, and it landed like a shrug. Fragments, sketches, instrumentals that stopped when they felt like stopping. Critics who had spent a decade calling him the great craftsman heard an unfinished demo tape and said so. But buried in the middle of it was Maybe I'm Amazed, a love song to Linda so obviously enormous that it became the one thing nobody could argue with. He played every instrument on it. It's still in his live set today. That's the pattern that repeats for the next 50 years, so hold on to it. The critics judge the packaging. The songs outlive the reviews. Then came Ram in May 1971, and this is where it turned ugly. Ram reached number 2, and it got savaged. Rolling Stone dismissed it as insubstantial and irrelevant. It was credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, which got him sued by publishers who didn't believe she'd contributed anything. He told Melody Maker he'd tried hard, that he thought he'd made a great album and hoped people would like it. They didn't. Not then. Over the years, Ram has been slowly reclassified as one of the best things he ever did. But one listener heard it very clearly in 1971. The opening track, Too Many People, contained lines Paul later admitted were pointed at John Lennon. A remark about somebody preaching, a line about taking a lucky break and snapping it in half. John's reply arrived that September on Imagine in a song called How Do You Sleep? It accused Paul of being a lightweight, mocked him for writing pretty tunes, and told him the only song he'd ever really done was Yesterday. It even worked in the old rumor that Paul was already dead. The slide guitar solo on it was played by George Harrison. Read that back. Paul McCartney's former songwriting partner made a record calling him talentless, and their lead guitarist showed up to play on it. This is the moment where most people would have gone quiet for 5 years, made a tasteful record, waited for the storm to pass. Instead, Paul made the least strategic decision available to him. He was going to build another band, and he was going to make it a real one with a name that wasn't his. The band was called Wings, and almost nobody took it seriously. The lineup came together across 1971. Denny Laine on guitar, who had sung Go Now with the Moody Blues and had genuine credibility. Denny Sewell on drums, an American session player Paul auditioned in a derelict New York building with no electricity, which very nearly convinced Sewell he was about to be robbed. And Linda McCartney on keyboards. Linda was a photographer, a great one. She was not a trained musician, and Paul put her on stage anyway, which handed every critic in Britain a free swing. They took it for years. Paul's reasoning was simpler than the sneering allowed for. He just lost the band that had been his entire social world. He was not going to spend the next decade in an empty studio while his wife stayed home. If he was going to do this, they were doing it together. The first Wings album, Wildlife, arrived at the end of 1971 and got a reception somewhere between polite and hostile. Then the singles started, and they were deliberately, almost aggressively un-Beatle-like. Give Ireland Back to the Irish, a protest song about Bloody Sunday, was banned outright by the BBC. Then, of all things, Mary Had a Little Lamb, a nursery rhyme, which critics treated as proof he'd lost his mind. Here's the tension the audience of 1972 couldn't resolve, and it's the engine of this entire story. Paul wanted Wings to be a band. The world wanted another Beatles. Those two things were never going to fit in the same room. Every review of Wings was really a review of what Wings wasn't. Every song got measured against Hey Jude, which is not a fair fight for any song written by anyone. So Paul made a decision that his manager, if he'd had one, would have talked him out of immediately. He put the band in a van and went looking for an audience that hadn't made up its mind yet. On the 9th of February 1972, a rented Ford Transit pulled onto the campus of Nottingham University. Inside were Paul, Linda, 3 children, 3 dogs, 2 roadies, and a band with no manager, no agent, and roughly 11 songs to its name. There was a truck behind them with the gear. The roadies went and found the Students' Union and asked whether they'd like a band to play. Somebody chalked it up on a blackboard in the bar. Word moved through the building in minutes. At lunchtime, in a ballroom with a fire limit of 800 people, one of the most famous men alive played his first public concert since the Beatles stopped touring in August 1966. Understand what he'd given up to be standing there. He had been playing to stadiums by the age of 22. Now he was doing a lunchtime set for students, some of whom had exams that afternoon. And he would not play a Beatles song, not one. Not as an encore, not as a favor, not when the crowd wanted it. They played what they had, material from Wildlife, a few rock and roll standards, some blues jams. They ran out of songs and repeated them. Paul would take a request for a number they'd already played and just play it again. The tour ran 11 days across 11 towns. They didn't book hotels in advance and got thrown out of one in Hull. They lived on fish and chips and listened back to tapes of their own gigs in the van, like any nervous new band. Paul has said it was the strangest thing, going from being one of the most famous people in the world to a semi-professional outfit playing student halls. He's also said the point was exactly that. He couldn't lean on the fame. It wasn't a crutch he was allowed to use. Now here's the question that decides everything that follows. Why would a man who had already won do this? Because the alternative was a nostalgia act, and he could see it coming. Play the hits, take the money, become a museum. Paul had watched the machine of Beatlemania close around 4 people, and he knew exactly how fast an audience will turn you into a memory of yourself. The university tour was primitive, under-rehearsed, and occasionally shambolic. The reviews said so. It was also the only way to build a band that had a life of its own. And the gamble was about to pay off in a way nobody, including Paul, could have scripted. By 1973, Wings had a lead guitarist, Henry McCullough, and Wings had hits. Red Rose Speedway went to #1 in America. My Love went to #1 in America. Then came the theme to Live and Let Die, one of the great Bond themes, which picked up an Oscar nomination. So Paul did the thing he always does when something works. He raised the stakes. He asked EMI for a list of every studio they owned anywhere in the world, spotted one in Lagos, Nigeria, and booked it. He pictured African rhythms, sunshine, a beach, a total break from everything London represented. Then, weeks before the flight, Henry McCullough had a row with him at the farm in Scotland and quit. Then, the night before they flew, Denny Sewell called and quit too. Wings had a lead guitarist and a drummer. Now Wings had neither, and the flights were booked. Paul went anyway, with Linda, Denny Lane, and Jeff Emmerich, the engineer who had worked on Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. 3 musicians and a record to make. Paul played the drums, the bass, and most of the lead guitar himself. Lagos was not what he'd imagined. The country was still recovering from civil war. The studio was half finished, kitted out with equipment nobody seemed to know how to use. It was the tail end of monsoon season. Then one night, Paul and Linda were walking back from the studio, which they'd been warned not to do. A car pulled up. 5 men got out. One had a knife. They took the cameras, the cash, and a bag. In the bag were the demo tapes and a notebook of handwritten lyrics for the album they'd flown 4,000 miles to record. Linda shouted at them that her husband was a musician. It's possible that saved their lives. In Lagos at the time, thieves often killed the people they robbed to avoid being identified later. The tapes were never recovered. Paul assumed they'd been taped over by men who had no idea what they were holding. So he rebuilt the record from memory. Every song, reconstructed from whatever had stuck in his head. He also, reportedly, collapsed during one session, gasping for breath and convinced for a moment that something was seriously wrong. The album he brought home from that was Band on the Run. It's got a title track about breaking out of somewhere and a line about what happens if we ever get out of here. Paul has said that line came from a Beatles business meeting, from the feeling of being trapped inside the thing everyone else envied. Band on the Run went to #1 in Britain and America. It gave him Jet and the title track. It's the record where the argument stopped, the one even the people who'd spent 3 years sharpening their pencils had to concede. Then Wings just kept going. Jimmy McCullough on guitar, Joe English on drums, Venus and Mars in 1975, and another American #1 single with Listen to What the Man Said. Wings at the Speed of Sound in 1976 with Silly Love Songs and Let 'Em In. And Paul deliberately giving other members of the band songs to sing. Pause on that title for a second because it isn't a coincidence. For years, the standard insult aimed at Paul was that he wrote sentimental slush, pretty tunes, nothing underneath. And the loudest voice making that accusation was John, who had publicly reduced Paul's entire contribution to a pile of soppy love songs. Paul's response was not an interview, it was not a statement. He wrote a song that opens by admitting the charge, agreeing that you'd think the world had heard enough silly love songs by now, and then asking what exactly is wrong with that. He has said the point was to answer the people who called him soft, and that the cynics were often the ones who hadn't been lucky enough to feel it. Then he took that song to #1 in America for 5 weeks. It finished as the biggest song of 1976. It was his 27th American #1 as a songwriter, and it made him the first person in history to land the year-end #1 with 2 completely different acts. He didn't win the argument with John. He just made the argument into a hit and let it play on every radio in the country. Then the tour that ended the argument for good. Wings Over the World rolled across 3 continents and broke attendance records as it went, including a reported 67,000 people indoors in Seattle. The live album from it, Wings Over America, went to #1 in the States. And in November 1977, Wings put out a slow Scottish waltz with bagpipes on it, in the middle of the punk explosion, at a moment when the Sex Pistols were the most notorious band in Britain. Mull of Kintyre spent 9 weeks at #1. It became the first single in British history to sell over 2 million copies. It outsold She Loves You. It stayed the biggest selling UK single of all time until Band Aid in 1984. 5 years after playing a student dining hall to 800 people, Paul McCartney had the best-selling British single ever released. But look at who is standing next to him in every photograph from that decade. Because the story people tell about Wings almost always leaves her out, and the story doesn't work without her. Linda McCartney was not, by anyone's account, a natural keyboard player. She had a career of her own already. She was the first woman to shoot a cover for Rolling Stone, and she had photographed nearly everyone worth photographing in the 60s. What she gave Paul was harder to review than a keyboard part. They married in March 1969. She was there through the lawsuit, the drinking, the year on the farm when he couldn't see a way forward. When he decided to build a band, she got on the bus, took the abuse from critics who called her a passenger, and stayed on it for a decade. They were almost never apart. They famously spent only a handful of nights of their marriage in separate places, and one stretch of those was the result of a Japanese prison cell, which we'll get to. Here's the contrast worth sitting with. The Beatles' years gave Paul the world and cost him almost everything ordinary. Meetings, lawyers, screaming, 4 men who couldn't be in a room together by the end. The Wings years were chaotic and unglamorous and full of criticism, and they were also a family driving around in a van with the dogs in the back. He wasn't recreating the Beatles, he was building the opposite of them. And the hardest test of that life was still 20 years away. Before that, everything nearly came apart again, and this time it wasn't the critics. On the 16th of January 1980, Paul, Linda, and their 4 children landed at Narita Airport in Tokyo. Wings had 11 concerts booked across Japan, the first shows there since the Beatles played in 1966. Around 100,000 tickets had sold. Customs opened his suitcase and found 219 grams of cannabis sitting in among his clothes. He hadn't hidden it. He later said the stuff was too good to flush. He was handcuffed, questioned, and taken to the Tokyo Narcotics Detention Center, where he became prisoner number 22. Japan treated smuggling on that scale as a 7-year offense with hard labor. His band sat in a hotel with no idea whether he was coming out. He spent 9 days in a cell measuring roughly 8 feet by 4. He cleaned it himself, bathed with the other prisoners rather than take special treatment, and read science fiction books Linda brought in. George Harrison sent a telegram telling him to keep his spirits up. On the 25th of January, the prosecutor let him go and deported him. The tour was canceled. Paul paid the promoter and the crew every penny they were owed, so that the only person who lost money on it was him. Wings never recovered. Denny Laine walked in April 1981 and released a solo album called Japanese Tears, which was not subtle. The band Paul had spent 10 years defending was finished, and it was his own fault. Then, 11 months after Tokyo, on the 8th of December 1980, John Lennon was shot dead outside his apartment in New York. Paul went into a studio in London the next day because he couldn't stand to be at home. Reporters were waiting outside when he left. He looked gray. He gave short, flat answers. And then, turning to go, he said 3 words that followed him for the rest of his life. Drag, isn't it? The press called it cold. Some fans never forgave it. Paul spent years explaining that he'd meant it in the heaviest possible sense, that he'd been in shock all day, and that it read differently in print than it sounded out of his mouth. His daughter Stella has since described what actually happened that morning. The phone call from America, her father walking outside, the most extreme reaction she had ever seen from him. And John's son Sean, who was 5 when it happened, has said the thing everybody missed. Watch Paul's eyes in that clip. It's not a man being cold. It's a man who cannot process what he's just been told. The rivalry, the lawsuit, the song accusing him of writing nothing but yesterday, all of it was now permanently unfinished. There would never be a resolution, an apology, a last conversation to fix it. Paul stopped touring. For most of the 80s, he barely played live at all. What he did instead was work. Tug of War arrived in 1982, produced by George Martin, and it's the most direct answer to grief he ever made. It went to #1. It contained Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder, which became his biggest American hit. It also contained Here Today, a song written as a conversation with John that Paul still finds difficult to sing. Then came a run of things that had no obvious strategy behind them at all. A duet album with Michael Jackson that produced Say Say Say, his last #1 single. A film that flopped. A cartoon frog. A classical oratorio. A Russian-only rock and roll covers album released in the Soviet Union in 1988 because he thought Soviet fans deserved something of their own. He was already a legend. He was making a cartoon frog record. That's the point. He never once organized his career around protecting the reputation. He kept behaving like a working musician who might fail, because to him, that was the job. In 1989, he finally went back on the road, and for the first time, he played Beatles songs at scale, on his own terms, on stages he'd chosen. He wasn't running from it anymore. He'd earned the right to hold it. Then, in December 1995, Paul and Linda announced that she had breast cancer. He had been here before. His mother, Mary, died of breast cancer in 1956 when he was 14. Nobody in the family talked about it. That was how grief was handled then. He has said the worst part was hearing his father crying through the wall one evening because they'd never heard him cry, and nobody said a word about it in the morning. For a while, the treatment seemed to be working. In March 1998, the doctors found the cancer had spread to her liver. She died on the 17th of April 1998 in Santa Barbara with Paul and their children there. She was 56. 2 days before, she had been out riding, which was the thing she loved most. Paul described himself afterwards as shipwrecked. He has said he cried on and off for about a year, that he kept expecting her to walk into the room because after 30 years, you simply expect the person to walk into the room. That it was almost embarrassing how much he cried, except that it was the only thing there was to do. Think about what she had actually been. Not the woman standing beside him, the woman who got in the van, who took a decade of reviews calling her a passenger and kept turning up. Who was there in 1970 when he couldn't get out of bed, and in 1980 when he was in a Japanese cell, and every single ordinary day in between. The man who wrote more famous love songs than almost anyone alive had to learn at 55 how to live without the person he'd written most of them for. He was, by any measure anyone would accept, finished. 60 was coming. He had the catalog, the knighthood, the money, and the safest possible exit available to any musician in history. He didn't take it. He went back into the studio. He kept touring into his 60s, then his 70s, then his 80s, with 3-hour sets and no teleprompter. In 2018, at 76, he released Egypt Station, and it went straight in at #1 in America. That was his first US #1 album since Tug of War in 1982, a gap of 36 years, one of the longest in the history of the Billboard chart. In December 2020, locked down and working alone at home with whatever instruments were in the room, he made McCartney III, exactly the way he'd made the first one 50 years earlier. It gave him his first UK #1 solo album since 1989. Then, a week after his 80th birthday, he headlined Glastonbury and became the oldest solo headliner in the festival's history. And he's still doing it. He toured America through the autumn of 2025. He published an oral history of Wings the same year. His manager has said a new album is finished and waiting on the artwork, and that he's planning to tour again, including a return to Japan, a country that once deported him. So what did Paul McCartney actually build after the Beatles? Not a comeback. Comebacks are for people who went away. He built the thing that is genuinely rare in music, which is a second body of work that can stand in a room with a first one and not apologize. Band on the Run, Maybe I'm Amazed, Live and Let Die, Jet, Mull of Kintyre, My Love. Over 100 million records sold under his own name and Wings, on top of everything the Beatles ever did. But the records aren't the achievement. Plenty of people have hits. The achievement is that in 1971, he was handed the easiest life in the world. Never work again, or work only on the past. Every incentive pointed at it. His reputation was damaged. His old partner was calling him a lightweight in public, and the safest possible move was to stop. He got in a van instead and drove to Nottingham to play for students who hadn't asked for him. He didn't replace the Beatles. That was never available. He did something harder, which was learning to be a musician again after being a monument. Go back to that courtroom on the last day of 1970. A man of 28, hated by a large portion of the people who had loved him, walking in to end the only life he'd ever known, convinced he was destroying himself in order to save something. For years, he has said, he almost believed the story everyone told about him, that he was the one who broke it, that he'd ruined it. More than 50 years later, the album is nearly done and the tour is nearly booked, and he's 83 years old. That's the answer. Not the sales, not the records, not the knighthood. Almost anyone can be great once, if the timing is right and the room is right and the other three people are right. Paul McCartney is the one who had to prove he could start again in a rented van in front of 800 students with everything already behind him. And he's still not finished.